Welcome to DIA. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I am DIA's Associate Curator and the organizer of the Artist on Artist lecture series, where since 2001 we invite an artist to reflect upon the work of another artist in DIA's collection and past program. And I am very pleased to introduce tonight's event, featuring Nicolás Guagnini on Bruce Nauman. But before then, I wish to thank everyone at DIA who helped making tonight possible. In particular, Isabel Elson, our Mellon Curatorial Fellow for the academic year, Max Tannen, Emily Markert, Kim Golding, David Anayamaya, and the visitor service team. DIA's relationship to Bruce Nauman began in 2000 with a two-person exhibition at DIA Center for the Arts across the street, followed by a presentation of his Mapping the Studio, where we are taking the perspective of a surveillance guard observing the artist studio at night, that was displayed in the galleries downstairs here in 2002. When DIA Beacon opened the following year, a long-term presentation of Nauman's work was installed in the building's lower level and remained on view through 2019. One of the featured works, one of my favorite, Left or Standing, Standing or Left Standing, from 1971, now in DIA's collection, features a maze-like succession of narrow triangular spaces bathed in disquieting yellow light. The environment is accompanied by a prose poem in 2 stanzas that describes a situation in detail but doesn't add up, and functions as a voiceover for the petrifying journey through the work. And then the yellow rooms that I made. I could never stay in them, Nauman once said about this work. Nicolás Guagnini is an Argentinian artist who has been living in New York since the 1990s. His work has included many collaborations, such as co-founding the cooperative gallery Orchard in the Lower East Side, active between 2005 and 2008, and the film production company Union Gaucha, in activity between 1997 and 2010. Other collaborative highlights to me include submitting himself to a prelapsarian regression on camera and a public psychoanalytic session in the context of a gallery show. Writing is a key component of Nick's work, and in fact, I first encountered his name as the author of Feedback in the Amazon, a refractory essay on video artist Juan Downey, published in the journal October in 2008. Currently, Nick is co-teaching a course at Harvard on Brazilian pedagogue Paulo Freire. A rearguard notions of style and stagnation, the theatrical, oral, and caricatural, are some of the tropes that Nick's work confronts us with these days. In his studios are scatological and crystalline ceramics that are towers of ears, potentially listening to us and taking their anachronistic colors from 1950s billiard balls and silk scarves. Their handmade origin at once sublimates and draws us down in an ominous twist that Nick might call antagonistic. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Nicolás Guagnini on Bruce Nauman.
Tonight's lecture is a tale that will be told from a provincial viewpoint, and that of New York City. And within that, from a rarefied and specific genealogical and comparative neighborhood, an expensive and upscale neighborhood, that of DIA Foundation. This is to say that the expected internationalism and third worldism won't be forthcoming tonight. The Global South will not intrude in these chambers, as it never has been invited since their inception in almost 50 years ago, in 1974. Tonight I'm going to discuss Bruce Nauman antagonism and his discursive withdrawal. Minimalists, post-minimalists, conceptual artists, and the original big four of institutional critique are fundamentally discursive artists. If we start with Judd and Flavin, which are cornerstones of DIA's foundations and ideology, not only were both superb writers, Judd perhaps the first and foremost writer of his generation, but there were also sloganeers of the highest order. Judd's most important essay, Specific Objects, doesn't need to be read. If you just heard these two words, you already understand what minimalism is. In complementing specific objects as a slogan, there's the famous Fleming allocution, "It is what it is and ain't nothing else." So if we consider these two adjacent sentences coordinated by an "and," it is what it is and ain't nothing else and it is what it is, we again have a proper description of what a specific object is. If we move to Morris and Sarah, who not only author a variety of texts and statements, Morris certainly was married to Rosalind Krauss, one of the foremost discourse producers of her generation, and Sarah has engaged in decades-long interviews with the historian Hal Foster, in both guaranteeing a discursive interpretation of their work that is to a vast extent self-controlled. If we further move to Graham and Smithson, in them the writing takes the space of the work, offsets the work, is the work itself, precedes the work, and brackets the work. We could also rightfully say that out of Graham's own writing, cultural studies proceed, or its even vaguer cousin, media studies. So, in contrast to all these artists, Nauman did not produce a discourse on Nauman. He didn't write texts, he didn't publish them, he didn't affiliate himself with any major art historian. Krauss and Bois did a text on him for their informal catalog, but he wasn't seeking or finding that kind of dialogue. And there are scattered interviews. There is a moral history at the Smithsonian, and the interviews are alarmingly inconclusive. There is information in them, and there are some statements, but you don't learn all that much about that work, and certainly did not constitute a set of discursive statements about what Nauman work is or is not. So that accounts for his comparative complete discursive withdrawal in relationship to the other artists of his generation. The conceptual artists, well, they have organs of dissemination of discourse. Art and Language has a magazine, the whole Set Sigela publication world, and then both Bochner and Kossuth are more than accomplished writers. The writing oftentimes is, in my view, superior to the work itself. If we go into the big four of institutional critique and we consider Michael Asher's ideological and subtractive critique of all the elements constitutive to exhibition making itself and the space of where the artwork resides, or Daniel Buren's epistemic dismantling of painting and via acompositionality and sites, situated works, we emerge out of that with the notion of a post-studio practice. This is founded on a text by Buren, The Function of the Studio. The other two institutional critique original artists, first Brothers and his symbolic conflation of empire, the nation state, and the signifiers of the museum and collecting, and Hans Haacke, systemic exposure of the economic underpinnings of institutions, where their images and text are articulated as a form of exposure or expose. All that work, which not only produces its own discourse, is fundamentally artwork to be decoded. There is a critique that is encoded in the artwork, and the viewer or spectator has to decode it with the discursive elements presented. Once that decoding takes place, the viewer or the spectator is aligned with the artist. You understand the critique, you supposedly agree, and institutional critique is ultimately a form of convergence. So as such, it is feel-good art. Nauman is feel-bad art. Nauman inaugurates something which is the idea of antagonizing the spectator, going against the spectator, and opens an axis of abjection that would later be taken by a variety of artists, but I will argue in the Freudian sense mostly by Paul McCarthy and aspects of Mike Kelly and John Miller. We're going to go into that a little later. So we're going to go quickly through some of Nauman's work and examine forms of antagonism in the work. So if we take the blinking neons, the ones that specifically deal with figures and sexuality are, to me, antagonistic in a way that they debase the idea of sex and eroticism, and they're machines. You know, a blinking neon is a circuit that in a rhythmic way lights are on and off, but the figures are never to be individualized. It's very difficult to project any kind of desire or identification with one figure or another. It points to the repetitive organic baseness of sex. As machines that depict sex, this also brings me to the early critical reception of Nauman, or something that has haunted Nauman through his career, which are the comparisons with Duchamp. And Nauman elicits that a little bit because his early work features a cast of his arm. Duchamp has a cast of part of his face and a cast of a vagina, but there's a classic art historical reading equating machines or machinery with sexuality on Dadaism in general and on Duchamp in particular. And there is this whole thing about the great glass being the desiring bachelors being a machine, and the bride. If we think about, and all this is to be decoded again, right? And Duchamp is the artist to be encoding and decoding at all times. All this is a poetics of sexuality, and here there's not only not poetics, but there is actually a debasement now, which is very antagonistic towards the spectator. You are hypnotized by the neon, but you're also put off by the repetition in sexuality there. And then the neons dealing with language, we saw the one before, malice, which is a deadpan word. This is a prime example. Let's compare them for a second with the language-based work at DIA, which would be Lawrence Wiener and Carl Andre. So we can think of Wiener as somebody very cleverly working the grammatical interplay between subject and object. There's the passive voice, there's the active voice, and this is spatialized. And then we can think of Carl Andre as through geometry and repetition and variations in the letters of work, creating some kind of materiality of language itself, or using language as a physical material with some kind of poetic resonance. Lawrence will hate this. Lawrence will always claim that he never did poetry. But the point is that these two artists make language do more than what it is. They enhance and enlarge our experience of language. Nauman compresses our experience of language, simplifies it. Fundamentally, Wiener and Andre do very intelligent art that makes you feel intelligent. Nauman does very stupid art that makes you feel stupid. And even the philosophical connotations about life and death and this list of verbs points to futility, fundamentally. The other question regarding Nauman's antagonism, and perhaps the main question, has to do with the body. Much has been written about minimalism and the Merleau-Ponty and the phenomenological perception of the body in it. We have in minimalism repetition being a key feature, a sequence of objects or things and a sequence of spaces between the things, and the space between the things is as important as the object, and that space is always airy, regular, imperial, as it were, normatized, a normatizing of your experience, Nauman position towards the spectator is of profound aggression. In the introduction, we just heard that he couldn't even stand his own corridors, but the body is always being compressed, even incarcerated, and displayed somehow to be seen. He also subjects his own body to performances, to endurance feats. But the fundamental attitude of Nauman's towards the experiential aspect of the body is traumatic and traumatizing through compression. Then, if space is a constitutive, space and the body is a constitutive part of his aggression, time and time-based work again is a form of antagonism. This is a 68 piece called Black Balls. So the first thing that Nauman does to antagonize the spectator is boredom and slowness. This is a 12 seconds take that, using a high-speed camera that was designed for industrial films, becomes 9 minutes on a very slow motion, semi-repulsive, semi-seductive action because of the close-up. It's also the first appearance of genitalia in Nauman's work. But in terms of it being antagonistic, a white male painting his balls black, it's guaranteed to upset many constituencies. It certainly negates the idea of a supremacy, but then and now certainly plays with identity in a way that it's destabilizing in an antagonistic manner. This is not to say that Nauman did not have politics of race. While he very rarely gave statements about his work, there are a few clues as to where his politics stood in the work, very, very few and very hermetic. But this is a piece of the same year called Train Piece. And while it's a slab on the floor, which we could connect to some of Richard Serra's stuff, underneath the slab, the work called Train for the jazz bebop musician John Coltrane is. This is the year that Coltrane dies. Coltrane within jazz is a figure associated with civil rights. One of his often played compositions is Alabama, which was in honor of Birmingham. But more importantly, the work is in the back because Coltrane turned his back to the audience. If we think about the position of the black jazz musician, and we think first of Satchmo, say, with his trumpet and his big smile, entertaining the white man, being the agreeable, clownish showman, an artist that refuses to entertain his audience while still playing his music, it's a celebration of a discursive refusal and a clear statement of where he stands in relationship to an admiration of black politics or a specific type of black politics. His politics don't exactly end there. There is a piece, this is in Diaz's collection, and it's called Circle for South America. There's another one, a Triangle for South America. These are 1980, and they evoke a subject under some kind of pressure, but this geometrical form. There are, as most of Nauman, antagonistic towards the spectator. If you walk around and you feel this may fall on you, they're always installed somehow in relationship to a room where you can't really walk around them. They're big. This is Diamond for Africa. But they register Nauman's discontent with the Condor Plan and the CIA-backed dictatorships in South America and the training of military for torture purposes, to the point that he donated one piece to the Museum of, I think it's called, is this the Museum of Resistance? It immediately after the Pinochet dictatorship ends, a dealer called Carmen Bo calls Museum of Solidarity calls for international artists to donate piece in solidarity with the people of Chile that have been oppressed and tortured by the regime. And Nauman sends a piece also with a chair, of which I don't have a picture, and it's the only Nauman in a public collection in South America. But he's clearly then expressing that political solidarity. This is called Diamond for Africa, and obviously may refer to the diamond trade. It's a little bit of an anti-apartheid piece. This is 1980. The legs of the chair are, if you were to play them, which you can't, as you can't see the Oracle train either, are tuned to D-E-A-D, dead, to the musical notes dead, and there's an early performance where he plays violin and plays these 4 notes. So again, his politics are very hermetic. They're just in a title. The work is fairly hermetic, but he does have ostensibly progressive politics, always within a context of antagonism towards both of his political object of rejection and viewership too. Then there is of course, clown torture, and I will claim that many of the possibilities that exist in Paul McCarthy works connect directly to these, but these are 2 traumatic figures, that of the clown and the terror that the clown elicits, and that of the fear of torture itself. And then we have a variety of sculptures, which are body parts, decapitated heads, dead animals that require not much explanation in their objection or in their antagonistic stance. So this is a quick walkthrough of the modes of antagonism or the main modes of antagonism in Nauman's work. Going back to the corridors, this is not to say that Nauman's own generation doesn't contain some antagonism and that it's all feel-good art and institutional critique. I claim it is. I'm going to focus on 2 artists, and I'm not going to show slides of them, and those will be Dan Graham and Richard Serra, artists that hate each other, and Dan will hate to be compared to Serra. But in a single sentence, perhaps we could think that Serra's transit from rubber to lead to his signature Cortex corrugated tough post-industrial steel and Dan's shiny steel with glass conform together a parable from the United States going into a powerhouse of the second industrial revolution into corporate culture, as also analyzed in Dan's essay Corporate Arcadias. And they both produce structures where the spectator comes in. Surely you have experienced both Graham and Serra, and as you could have here at Dia, across the street and in Beacon. When you are inside a Serra, you feel that you might be crushed by the steel, and in fact, a worker lost a leg and somebody died installing a Serra at one point. But you may feel disoriented in this curved elliptical structures. You may feel that they overwhelm your body. And when you go into the Dan Graham Pavilion, you may see yourself in different spaces and times, and you may see yourself very fat and very thin and deformed. And these are upsetting experiences. Dan's experience is an experience of quasi-schizophrenia that can make you rather paranoid. Now, very interestingly, none of these 2 artists who are fairly upfront and radical in many aspects of their discourse can claim antagonism for themselves. Quite on the contrary. Serra goes to great pains in his Foster interviews to disavow any type of antagonism, and Foster very tactfully but very relentlessly goes at all the claims. You disregard side, they're overwhelming, some people feel overpowered, and so on and so forth. And Serra goes as far as to say, well, they do many different things to many different people, but he quotes a young man who went, I think, on a tour on the Gulf War or something like that, one of America's many wars, suffered from PTSD. He nearly claims that the sculpture cured or helped him deal with his trauma, which is certainly a very feel-good interpretation. Dan had a long line of essays and interviews and titles of pavilions and pavilions themselves dedicated to childhood, on the idea of children's play, and with a positive value of children. Now, everybody here who ever had children know, and then whoever had to push children from pre-K into middle school, know that children's games are cruel and antagonistic. The idea that child's play is positive and nice, it's just a fantasy. But the point is that both artists, in their discourse, do not claim any form of antagonism. There is a caveat here that they both developed a large career in public art. So if you are to convince curators, institutions, private collectors, municipalities, cities, and biennials to build your staff, I think that going to tell them my work is antagonistic and you're going to feel crushed or schizophrenic and it won't fly. But irrespective of that, it is like if Nauman has sucked the antagonism out of his generation. It's a position that he and only he can claim, and the others cannot. There's the women's question, which is obviously Dia's question, and there is an artist in his generation that is as antagonistic as Nauman is, and that will be Lee Lozano. Lozano, in the highest of organized feminism, does a piece called Women's Peace, where he boycotts women. She won't talk to women even when she goes into a store, but specifically she will not answer a letter by Lucy Lippard. Lucy Lippard, who was one of the starters of Nauman's fame by including him in eccentric abstraction, say, among other things. This, for instance, that disparages the idea of success itself, is not only an antagonistic piece, but a self-antagonistic piece. And the word interplay and the deadpanness of the work is, to me, comparable to Nauman's very own. This epitomizes antagonism both in drawing and view. But going back to the women's question, or the answer to the women's question, the results of Lozano's self-antagonism and general antagonism in the work was, of course, exclusion. Self-exclusion. She dropped out, disappeared, and had a show at PS1 much later, 40 years after, without a catalog, and then 50 or 40 something years later, her estate, or is this the estate, or I don't even know. Nobody knows where Lozano went, or I don't know. Went into house her. Speaking of antagonism, Lozano did date Dan Graham, which is also recorded in a piece called Money Piece, where people put and take money out of a jar, and Dan takes $300 as a loan. And Dan, at the interpersonal level, was just about the most antagonistic artist in this time period. Dan said that his relationship with Lee failed because she was too antagonistic. So if Dan Graham says you're too antagonistic, that at the interpersonal level is to say something, irrespective of a little snippet of gossip. The work has a degree of antagonism, as Nauman's does. Now, this isn't to say that antagonism wasn't a mode of the minimalist, but the question with antagonism and the minimalist is that the antagonism operates at the level of discourse and activism. This is a 1970 ad in our Forum magazine by John Weber Gallery, and we have Andre Flaving, Lewitt, Sambach, Smithson, and Ryman, so no less than 6 Dia artists. And you can see in the list that there's also Robert Overby. Overby was a California artist. He had a variety of styles. At the time, he was doing casts of architectural elements in some kind of resin or rubber that then weakened those forms. The Overby lecture will be another interesting lecture. I'm not going to give it tonight. But one of the points is that Overby work and all the critical reception of the period says that it derives from Nauman. And it's very close to Nauman's, or it looks like Nauman's. That was the accusation against Overby. Now, the artist, led by Dan Flavin, sent a letter to John Weber and talk to John and tell them that they don't like Oberby and that they will quit the gallery if John Weber shows Oberby. So Weber goes as far as to put all this shit in writing and to tell him that he does not share the opinion of the artist, but he has no other option, which is pretty spineless of Weber as a dealer, it must be said. But he cancels the show. So effectively, Flavin lobbies other artists to kick an artist out of a normative gallery, something that back then and still today could make or break a career. This is Oberby's masterful reply, the dust in my, which is an artwork in and of itself. In the same year, 1971, there is the episode of the Guggenheim, the 6th Guggenheim International. The Guggenheim International, which meant, as it did mean for the International, meant Europe and the United States for the Guggenheim then, featured American and European artists, and the American contingent was minimalist. Judd, Flavin, Sandbach, Morris with minimalist work. So Daniel Buren produced a large banner with his typical stripes that hang from the top of the rotunda all the way down. It is installed, and then the artist, led by Flavin, lobby the Guggenheim curators and director, claiming that work interferes with the rest of the works in the show. I find it incredible that Flavin will claim interference if he works with light, which in and of itself, it's a form of interference in anything that coexists in the space. The point is that Flavin succeeds at this, and Buren, rightfully so, says, I am being censored. There's a whole tussle, and then Flavin mocks Buren in not only in his Francesque, but also in his Marxism. I must be a sinister American petit bourgeois imperialist. And then the party lines on American artists, and then the stab will be Little Buren, if ever again he surfaces in New York. Then, the tussle intensifies, and there's letters between Flavin and Buren. He just sends him to fuck off, essentially. The next year, let me go back a few years. When Flavin emerges as an important artist, he is given 5 pages in our forum. And this testifies to the importance of being an artist writer for that generation. From the 1980s on, if somebody were to write a feature on you to introduce you at a magazine or at our forum, it is a critic introducing you. But back then, you kind of had to introduce yourself. The feature was you talking about your own work. So very early in his career, he's given the opportunity in 1965, and he opens with an anti-black statement. I am a Caucasian in a Negro year. This is the year of civil rights. So essentially, he declares himself to be what today will be MAGA. And I'm white and overweight and anti-black. The second paragraph, which I haven't highlighted, calls his mother stupid. So his position on women is also beginning to be clarified in this very early article. And then let me move violently forward to 1972, the year after of the Dia Foundation tussle. And at that time, there was a Duchamp retrospective, the Anne Danoncourt retrospective at MoMA. They ask a number of artists to write statements that also testifies to Flavin's importance at the time. So he writes this statement on Duchamp where he tells of his interactions with Duchamp, but he ends the statement saying, just suppose I was a better chess player than Duchamp. And the italics are Flavin's, they're not the catalog editors. And then he goes at the grandiose Duchamp myth, like, do we really need to mythify this other little French guy? So be it. So we can conclude that Flavin didn't like black people Europeans, French in particular, Marxists in particular. He was a better player than Duchamp. This is another clear statement on his position on women. This is way later. This is 84. He became a dog breeder, and he had a dog called Airily, who competed in state and won national and state competitions. So he devotes an exhibition to his dog, who was a female dog, and he does not hesitate to put the word bitch on a invitation card. This is all to say that minimalism was predicated in antagonism to everything else, not being itself. I can hypothesize what were the conversation between Judd and Flavin and Rainer and Heiner Friedrich and de Menil, but it is clear that they used the muscle to kick artists out of galleries and to kick artists out of exhibitions and to form criteria. And this isn't irrelevant. The exhibition criteria of Dia, with the incredibly airy spaces, the notion of genius for the artist, the absolute devotion to a very exclusive set of artists, reverberates through the world in Glenstone, in Marfa, in Inhotim in Brazil, in the projects sprouting up in Saudi Arabia. It's also a model for private museums. Every time somebody establishes a private museum, the first criteria to be looked at will be Dia's. This form of exclusion or antagonistic exclusion has to do with this criteria formation. Now, Nauman has in 1973 survey show at the Whitney with 8 years of his production very early on. So it was clear that Nauman was already like a major figure, and Diaz established it in 74. Nauman is clearly not on the list. Again, it's only a hypothesis, but something tells me that Flavin and Judd did not want Nauman around in this construct. So Nauman enters the Dia collection, as Matilde explained, very late, and for everybody in this room and for my generation, these works were installed for 16 years there, 2003, 2019, so 16 years. So this was until the 2018 retrospective for most of the New York working artists. This was our Nauman. And it was very beautifully and very cleverly installed by the then ruling team. The administration was Michael Gowan, and the curator was Lynn Cook. It features Nauman as a prince of darkness. If we think about the Dia construct, the biggest constraint and the biggest imposition of what can or cannot go on Dia is the light itself. It's a vast industrial building with natural light, so it has to be work that withstand lights. And Nauman thrives as a prince of darkness. Even the studio, which is the space for sublime revelations, this is the Nauman's work, which is, I think, is a 24 hours really boring video of a studio where what happens is that animals go through his studio in New Mexico. So rats go through and a cat goes through. These are the accidents and the action and the plot twists of this video. But to me, this installation always did two things. First, it introduced the symbolic into the question of Dia, which is devoid of symbols and the symbolic, but it functions like a bowels of minimalism, like the sewage of minimalism. In the same period that this was installed, there were surely the monuments to Tatling, which also looked like the Empire State, which are white lights on a very illuminated and white space on top. So here you see more basement stuff. And then there is something very a record of the antagonism of Nauman and why he's a prince of darkness, or why he must be suppressed in the basement in front of minimalism, can be also tracked in his critical reception. The critical reception to Nauman is itself antagonistic. This is very early, but Bochner, who was at the time writing reviews, criticizes him for his, I mean, the form fails, the content fails, but fundamentally is tired. Tired in the sense that it's something that has been hashed before, that is repetitive or derivative. And then Pinchas Witten, a normative critic of the period, a very normative critic on the period, talks about the infantile narcissism, which is a recurrent trope on the negative criticism on Nauman, which is the infantilism has to do with the stupidity unmentioned. This is, of course, the claim on his youth that he's derivative. It's never clear what he will be derivative of. At points, he's derivative of Duchamp, but he's derivative, and every artist in the audience knows that this is one of the things that hurts the most. If somebody calls you, I think the one thing that hurts more than derivative is generic. Somebody says a work is generic. I mean, and as a overarching adjective that can include both derivative and generic, and this is the kiss of death, is when somebody tells you your work is interesting. We go to Hilton Kramer. Kramer, please understand that at that time, before Instagram, criticism was very important. And Hilton Kramer was the chief critic of New York Times. To understand perhaps the scope of his importance, he did the hatchet job on Philip Gaston. When Gaston went from abstract expressionism to a figurative, caricaturesque painting, he was attacked in a two-pager by Kramer. That ended Kramer's career. His gallery dropped, not Kramer's, Gaston's career. His gallery dropped him, and he didn't sell for a very long time. And near the end of his life, he had a show at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which back then wasn't even an important place, and derailed Gaston 30 years off. So this is an important attack, and it's not only the derivativeness, because he takes on our historical tropes that have already been rehashed, a corpse that is already rotting. But the language that Nauman elicits in his career is unparalleled in terms of antagonism, boring and repugnant. This is for his first kind of survey. And then again, this is interesting, the idea of terrorism by art history, because our historians were not insisting on Nauman, nor they are today. Nauman never had the art historical establishment on his back. But the perception of it's not only of the antagonism, but it's also that they're trying to ram this big figure that amounts to nothing down our throat. Who's the they in that sentence is unclear, but he's always been resisted by and antagonized by the press in that sense. This is a minor, lesser-known writer, but he's irritating or pointless, which is my claim about his language work. Deliberately off-putting, Hughes also being a normative writer of the period, a supposedly important critic of the period. So aggro, solipsism, tension, repetition, torpor, and bad jokes. This is to me outstanding criticism, but again, I asked the artists in the audience who could tolerate even one of these reviews, let alone 40 years of this coming on you. And this is a selection. Kramer goes at him again for a third time. This is my favorite, idiotic curators. This is one of my favorite headlines in the whole of art history. But idiotic somehow goes also onto Nauman, but the claim is again that the establishment, the curators and the art historians, are idiotic because they even support this. And then he, of course, goes at Nauman himself. And then in the incessant repulsive noise, pain, insult, and degradation, very accurate descriptions of Nauman's work. Very, very accurate descriptions of Nauman's work. And then this is Donald Caspit, who at one point held sway in Art Forum as a relevant critic. Talks about the malice towards the spectator, but wait for the next slide. There's a collection of insults: homophobic, anti-hedonistic, misanthropic, and misogynistic. in 2 sentences. I mean, in terms of eliciting negative criticism, this is the very top in our history, I would say. So something really interesting about this is that in the 2018 retrospective, there is an effort by the idiotic curators who curated the first show of attaching progressive discourse to Nauman. There's a set of essays being commissioned. Catherine Lord is someone to talk about violence against women, and hilariously in the text, she says she couldn't find any, and goes on to write a very good text. Glenn Ligon talks about Nauman. Ralph Lemon talks about what is to perform Nauman in a black body. I am asked to write about sex or sexuality, and obviously I write about sex and race. There's a great Rachel Harrison text that is about America and herself, like most of her texts, but it's very good. Not about Nauman, really. And the curators and art historians. But the point is that there's a complete re-evaluation of Nauman's work from the standpoint of political progressive viewpoints of 2018. There's even a DIA volume. DIA commissions a bunch of artists, and there's a very good Charlene von Heil text. So DIA joins the effort of rehabilitating Nauman's negative perception. Idiotic curators win. In the end of the day, it's idiotic curators 2, Hilton Kramer 1. That's the final score. Holland Cotter, the most progressive critic of, or the most politically progressive critic of the New York Times, writes a glowing review. Art Forum commissioned several artists to do a reappraisal, and Nauman is entronized as a hero of progressiveness. And 5 years have passed since that, and I was part of that effort, and I look at the entire critical reception, and I have come to the conclusion that via antagonism and discursive withdrawal, Nauman became Don Teflon. You can cook everything on it, and nothing sticks. The food will come out well, so all these progressive ideas sit well with the work, but they really don't stick. And looking back, the negative criticism is superior and better describes the work and better accounts for the work than our progressive efforts. So this accounts for a dimension of the feel bad or the antagonism that to me has to do with a refusal to progress in the work, that the work never changes, that it revolves around it's very anti-Hegelian. There are no breakthroughs or periods. It revolves around the same 4 or 5 things. It always belongs to its time, but it seems to be almost outside time. Surely he's a post-minimalism. I mean, he's situated historically, and it's certainly he's at home at DIA historically. But there's something registered in the negative criticism that is not registered in the official great discourse about it. So I wonder, and this is an unresolved question, by the way, if you're expecting a conclusion, I don't have any. Because this is inconclusive. Nauman himself is inconclusive, and perhaps that is the merit. Perhaps that is what I'm trying to say. The avenues that Nauman opened for American art are the avenues of objection. And then going back to the deinstallation, you used to come out of the basement, and there was the Louis Bourgeois there that was always perfectly in place and somehow out of place. But Bourgeois, which comes from an entirely different tradition, I mean, she's actually affiliated with objection in the surrealist sense of objection. She's a surrealist artist. Comes into almost asking for permission, but not, and almost at DIA, but not at DIA, because it's just an interstitial space. The DIA idea is that there are no there's nothing interstitial. Everything is major and normatized by the industrial building. And then there are two other pieces in Diaz collections, which are these kind of flaxseed dicks. There are 6 dicks in Diaz collections. 4 are flaxseed, 1 is erected. 5 are flaxseed, 1 is erected. 4 are bourgeois, and 2 are in the Nauman hangman piece, 1 flaxseed and the other is erected when the man is hanged. But this question of antagonism and this door that Nauman opens, which you can see in Paul McCarthy, again dealing with genitalia and certainly the abject. There's even more abject stuff, a lot of it. Body parts, another Nauman speciality, decapitation, but actually enacted, and some daddy figures. Then this axis of objection extends into certain aspects of Mike Kelly's work, particularly in relationship to scatological stuff. Infantile regression, remember, that's one of the accusations, infantilism being one of the accusations of the negative criticism. The whole question of children and the supposed abuse of children, which then Kelly answers in the educational, in his work, The Educational Complex. And then finally, some aspects of John Miller's work. This is a phallus made of feces, and if you allow me to translate these from Greek and Latin into English, this is a dick made of shit. Which is pretty antagonistic and pretty abject. But now if we take these artists together and if we take this genealogy together, which moves along a very Battalian vector, it's also very Freudian. All of McCarthy's work are popular myths, Disney, Heidi, or father figures, Hitler or Trump. Mike Kelly goes as far as to analyze several Freudian ideas, the caricaturesque and more importantly the uncanny, and then Miller goes on to elaborate on the relationship between shit and gold and value creation. And it also must be reminded that both Kelly and Miller are outstanding writers, Miller perhaps being the best writer of his generation. So again, this objection is antagonistic, but again is to be decoded and it contains its own discourse, as if it were a form of insurance. Only Nauman has this Olympian, aloof, distant antagonism. So in that sense of feel bad and not justifying it, one of the things that occurs to me is that now, today, there's an enormous pressure on healing, that the artist be a healer, that we must heal. The milk of your dreams will never be sour, and those dreams will never be nightmares. We are going to reconnect you to Mother Earth with some epistemologies of the Global South. And there are futurities, black futurities, indigenous futurities, but all will wash your guilt and make you feel good. None of this will make you feel bad. And the artist will heal because the institution will help you heal through the healer artist. And I think that's reductive, a little perverse towards the question of otherness, because it's asking to the other to right a wrong that originally was inflicted on the other. And also it simplifies art to a social function that politics cannot fulfill. So in front of the healer, I think that Nauman should be the artist of the now, that the antagonist should be upheld. And in that sense, I feel that Nauman, And with my idiotic mini performance, I conclude tonight my remarks on Bruce Nauman as my Artists and Artists talk at Dia Foundation. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know how I can do this because that was so brilliant. I'm still in the awe of it. But I just wanted to add one thing to the antagonism, which is, I think what drew me to Nauman initially was attention, pay attention, and that there's something about his work, and I first saw this, I was recently out of grad school, incredibly annoyed at the dependence on discourse that art history had taken, that all the best critics could only write on artists who had already talked about their own project. So like Nauman fell out of that, Twomley fell out of that. But my young son, at a very young age, went with me to a MoMA retrospective and was obsessed with Nauman. We went 4 times, and for years we'd go back to MoMA, and he would always say, "Where's Bruce Nauman?" But what he saw, he stood for hours in front of walking in an exaggerated manner around the periphery of a space. And what I noticed watching him watch is that you had to pay attention. It was incredibly boring. And he swiveled his hips, and it was, what's her name, the dancer who choreographed that. He didn't choreograph it himself. And no, with an M. I'll think of it in a minute. And not Twyla Thor. But that he would walk repeatedly around this square of his, studio, and just when you wanted to think about something else, because Trisha Brown. Actually, it's not Trisha Brown. I'll get. Anyway, just when you wanted to look away, he'd swish his hips, and you had to look back, and it disenabled you. It thoroughly prevented the possibility of thinking about anything else, and I feel like that makes him a now man right now too, because we want to. It's antagonistic, but it's very specific, and it's.
Well. I'm not sure you have a question. You have a great statement.
No, but I just want to add to that. I just want to add that I feel like that plays into the antagonism.
This is registered in the negative critical reception.
Yes.
In the narcissism, what makes the antagonism so seductive and makes it want to look at it again and again is that he's so unabashedly narcissistic, and that he accepts that he is traumatized. There's not a moral discourse on trauma, as there can be construed in a negative or positive manner out of the abject artist I mentioned later. So he takes full responsibility and also washes his hands from that. That's why we pay attention, and that's part of the Olympian distance that he elicits with the work. But it's a good compliment to it's a positive reading of the negative critical reception, yes.
I think, yes, that was brilliant. Thank you, Nick. I wonder, I hope this is aligned with your argument, or I'm curious the degree to which it's aligned with the argument, but I wonder if you thought about, or how you bring into your line of thinking Nauman's relationship to humor, or dark humor, or kind of the Buster Keaton likeness of Nauman's practice to some degree, because I think that it's a big part of it. And humor has of course an interesting connection to both feeling good and feeling bad, and I just wanted to see if that played a role in your thinking.
Well, there's this little essay by Freud, The Joke and its relationship to the unconscious. Humor is a metabolizer of trauma, and also that which is repressed re-emerges in humor. The thing with Nauman's humor is that it's deadpan. Dan Graham had the same argument, that Nauman is all about humor. The thing that to me is most striking and that creates the most antagonism in his humor is that you never know who is the joke on. Is the joke on me and I'm stupid because I'm liking this boring shit? Is the joke on him because he keeps on walking and doing that? Who is being laughed at here? And that question is always there in the humor and in the panness. You can never assign a value. The critical reception also registers that. It talks about bad jokes. So the humor at bad jokes are stupid jokes. So certainly the question of humor aligns with the argument, and it aligns with the Mike Kelly arguments on the caricaturesque, which is a specific form of humor, even of political humor, being more revealing than the ideal, which is another Freudian argument. But that line of thought, yes, it's there. The proponents of that line of thought were Graham and Kelly, I would say, in relationship to jokes. But yes, the argument aligns. But Anthony, you can antagonize me and disagree with my arguments.
Okay, if there's no more questions, thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.